if you look at it from the perspective of volumes, the industry is in a chronic period of recession. The number of watches that Switzerland is exporting has halved in less than a decade. Thierry Stern needs to be careful, if I'm perfectly honest.
So Robin, you've been in the industry for 20-something years. You write for the likes of the New York Times, the Financial Times, Robb Report, Vanity Fair. I'm sure I'm missing a few here. Surely you've got the dream job.
The dream job? Goodness, well, it depends what you want to do with your life, doesn't it? If you want to be a writer for a living and you like some of the finer things in life, yeah, I suppose it's a pretty good gig. Yes, I'm fortunate in that respect.
And so in the time that you've been in the industry, I imagine that time you've seen a lot of changes.
Yeah.
What would you say that the biggest changes are that you've seen?
Yeah, I think the way that the story, the products, the brands, the industry are communicated is the big change. I mean, in many ways, the product hasn't really changed that much at all. We're still talking about Carreras and Speedmasters. We're still talking about Patek. We're still talking about Rolex. And often with designs and product which has existed for many decades prior to me coming anywhere near the industry. But in 2003, which was my first tiptoe into the industry, the media space was dominated. So dominated is a big word. I mean, it was a very small hobbyist space, as I think has been fairly well reported in contemporary media and on podcasts and so on in the last few years. But when I started, I was editing a magazine for a watch retailer for Watches of Switzerland. And that was one of very few watch magazines around the world. There were a few online forums, the sort of the Purist Pro and the Time Zones of this world, where hobbyists, collectors, I would say largely a slightly sort of older man type, were very keen to discuss what was going on in the watch sector. But it was in the early stages of the industry's revival, really. I think we know the story now of the quartz crisis and the collapse of many brands. Sort of 1,000 or so watch companies, Swiss watch companies, disappeared in the 70s and 80s. And the 90s was this time of slow revival, but it wasn't really until the 2000s that the story started to explode. And I suppose I found myself in the right place at the right time without ever really having intended to find myself in that space. I never set out to build a career in watches or writing about watches. But I was working for an agency that had this magazine, and the industry has been revolutionized since in the way that it's communicated. So there were no blogs, there was no Instagram, obviously. I mean, there was no social media. So the conversation happened either through internet forums, through the sort of handful of magazines. 0024 was around, QP magazine was around, and then a number of the newspapers published supplements discussing watches. But largely speaking, it was quite quiet. There wasn't much noise. There wasn't a lot of chatter around watches. And I think that's been the biggest change over the past 20 years. And it's been terrific because so many people have come into the space, so many voices. So, I mean, it's much more international than it ever was. And it's made it a more critical space too, which some will find that hard. But actually, overall, I think that's an enormously positive thing. The industry is held to account in a way that it wasn't 20 years ago. It pretty much had all its own way for a very long period of time. And now it has to answer to a much more demanding audience than ever before. And that audience isn't just the critics, but obviously mostly the audience is the end consumer. And the end consumer is much more demanding now than it was 20 years ago. So the brands have to work harder to get cut through, to remain relevant, and to convince the world's media they want to talk about it, and then to convince the customer they want to buy it, which makes for a really interesting tapestry.
Of course, 20 years ago, we didn't really have the likes of YouTube. We didn't have that, podcasts weren't a thing.
Of course, by and large, those channels are used by end consumers who have very broad range of interests, and a lot of the content they consume will be very commercial, very consumerist. They will focus heavily on popular culture. And the smart brands have sort of capitalized on the sort of content that's being produced and worked alongside the sort of people who are producing the content that people are watching to try and put themselves into the zeitgeist. So the opportunity there is colossal, huge. But I wouldn't say yet the industry has fully figured it out or harnessed the potential in that space. And so while I would say that, broadly speaking, comprehension of what a luxury watch is and who the main players are in that space are, I would say that's increased significantly over the past 20 years and over the past 10 in particular, as you say. But I wouldn't say that's yet translated into a significant increase in the industry's sales footprint. In fact, the opposite has been happening to an extent.
I mean, I think mainly you could argue that perhaps in the microbrand space, mediums like YouTube, like podcasts and things like that have perhaps helped those smaller brands to have a platform and create an audience that they may not have traditionally had. But I do think I tend to agree with you in terms of there are a lot of the bigger, more established brands who perhaps haven't yet fully got to grips with it.
Yeah, it's interesting that we turn to microbrands so early in our conversation, isn't it? And they are suddenly a very significant part of the landscape, certainly in terms of storytelling, and certainly in terms of how brands are using the sort of contemporary palette of media to present themselves to the world. However, they remain a very small part of the pie in terms of their market share, in terms of the volumes they're producing, and in terms of the revenues that they're driving. But you know, time continues to roll on, and fortunately for us all. But the impact they may have over the next 25 years could yet be huge, because they are communicating with a generation of customers who are looking for their own thing. They're looking to take ownership of their purchases. They don't necessarily want to purchase what previous generations purchased. They don't necessarily think something is cool that has been cool for 50 years may no longer be cool to a new generation of consumers. So the opportunity for some of these brands to grow is huge, and simultaneously, I think we will see a number of the so-called bigger players, or at least the more established brands, struggle because they haven't figured out how to harness the direction of travel in terms of communication, in terms of consumer appetite. So yeah, it's I wouldn't say that the industry's in any sort of existential crisis. Far from it, really. I think the established brands are very established and they have fantastic brand awareness, and there are some very smart people running these companies, and they're doing a very good job of making sure they remain relevant. But something that I've been writing about routinely for the last 2 or 3 years is that we're no longer in the business of selling watches. We're in the business of making brands relevant. I say we. I mean, I'm not selling watches. I'm a journalist. But the industry is in a season now where it simply needs to make itself relevant, and the sales will follow. And I think there are lots of companies that haven't quite figured out how to stay relevant and stay in the zeitgeist.
Certainly, it feels like we have been in quite a challenging market over the last year, 18 months, at least, possibly a little bit longer than that. The global economic picture has been challenging. Mm-hmm. You only need to look at other industries as well. Property, cars. I could carry on. One of the things, whenever I talk about this in a lot of my videos, I often get a lot of comments from people saying, it's a load of rubbish. We've just returned back to pre-pandemic levels. But actually, when you look at some of the figures that come out, it doesn't necessarily support that argument, because the industry was possibly more buoyant in 2018, 2019 than it is today.
Yeah, it depends how you measure these things, doesn't it? I mean, I'm a bit of a sucker for the figures, and I enjoy watching the graphs as they go up and down. I've been following the FHS's statistics. The FHS, I don't know whether the audience will know that the Swiss Watch Federation, which has a very tight handle on Swiss watch exports, both by volume and by value, and across a number of different categories determined by price point. And if you look at the figures over the last 10 years, there are some of it makes for great reading, and some of it makes for really quite uncomfortable reading. So yes, 2023 by value was a record year. And there are a number of brands that have been making hay while the sun has shone. But at the same time, if you look at it from the perspective of volumes, the industry is in a chronic period of recession. So 2015, which was the last peak, Switzerland exported around 29.5 million watches, which is, that figure's from a little earlier. I think it was around just over 28 million watches in 2015. Obviously, there's been a significant dip created by COVID in the middle of this, but last year that figure had dropped down to below 17 million, sort of 16 point something or other. I forget the exact number off the top of my head. And that figure includes the mighty Moon Swatch, which Swatch Group I don't think are reporting any longer exactly how many of these things they're shifting, but it's perfectly reasonable to expect it to be around 1.5 million, maybe 2 million a year, something like that. Perhaps the numbers have dropped off a little bit as consumer appetite has cooled. But in 2022, volumes started to go back up again. 2023, they went up again, which was the first full year of Moon Swatch. But this year volumes are down by 10% to the end of September. So if you're taking Moonswatch out of the equation, if you're adding in the 10% that volumes have dropped by this year, then you're suddenly looking at maybe 14 million watches will be exported this year, which is, I mean, conveniently that's roughly half 2015. So I may be looking for a number there that doesn't quite exist. But either way, the number of watches that Switzerland is exporting has halved in less than a decade, which strikes me as whether that's a recession. I mean, by volumes it is. Whether it ends up being a significant recession for the industry at large is still to be seen. But I'm quite sad in a way that there are fewer watches being produced in Switzerland, fewer mechanical watches that are accessible to consumers, because that for me is where the industry comes alive. It's for the end consumer who is buying the one watch that they're ever going to buy for the one really special occasion. That's for me where the magic is. Collecting and so on, fine, there's a world for that, but it's very niche. It's actually very small. The number of people in this world who can buy a watch for under $1,000 is very, very small. And the industry cannot simply cater to those people. It needs to remember that there are 8 billion people on the planet, and actually for most of them there will be an appetite at some point in their lives to buy a nice something or other. And if that something or other is a watch, great. But if there isn't a product there for them to buy, then it won't be a watch, it'll be something else. And that for me it's just quite sad. It's just quite borderline tragic, I suppose. That's far too big a word to use, I'm sure, because we're talking about something that's fundamentally unnecessary. But it's an industry that sustains many lives. There are lots of people whose livelihoods are given to them by the watch industry, and a lot of people are very passionate about these things. And I don't like the idea that the industry is in recession, but the numbers don't really lie. Since 2015, the volumes have halved, but the average export value of a Swiss watch has doubled, and so that indicates for me one direction of travel.
There must be a level of recognition within the organisations, within the brands, that things aren't quite working at the moment. I mean, is that something that you see?
Behind closed doors, of course, there are plenty of brands out there who are fully cognizant of the fact that the business isn't great at the moment, and that they've got a challenge on their hands to try and reinvigorate it. And the question they're all asking is how. Yes, there are inevitably some brands out there who are who seem less concerned than others, but there may well be brands out there that are still doing quite well. Or often we don't know exactly how well individual brands are doing because the groups don't report by brand. Look at Richemont. Yes, Richemont is down 17% across its specialist watchmakers in the first half of this financial year. But how is Piaget doing? How is IWC doing? How is Cartier doing? We don't know exactly. Those figures are not published. So there may be one or two brands in there who are having a very nice time of it. Thank you very much. And sort of looking at everybody else and thinking about how much market share they're gaining in this season when lots of brands are having difficulties. So
absolutely, and you also mentioned, just going back to the figures slightly, you mentioned that there's a real difference between the figures we see in terms of volume, in terms of exports, and price or value, let's say. But obviously what we've also seen over recent years is a kind of move towards increasing retail prices.
Yeah.
Retail prices still seem to be going up. It's unlikely, I think, that we're going to see them come down. It doesn't feel like the kind of thing that brands will do, because I think that's too much of a recognition that they need to take action. But at the same time, it's counter to the laws of supply and demand.
They can't bring their prices down, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the costs of producing these things aren't coming down. So the Swiss franc, for starters, remains incredibly resistant. It's a very strong currency. I mean, in the time I've been working in the industry, the Swiss franc has doubled its value against the pound. I used to get 2.5 to the pound when I go over there. Now I get 1.2, 1.3 or something like that. So, the Swiss franc is incredibly resilient, and these factories, these Swiss companies that are paying their employees in Swiss francs in order to secure their Swiss-made status, their overheads are not coming down. And of course they've got to try and work with currency fluctuations all around the world, which often means they've simply got to put the prices up in order to make sure the prices are balanced, and of course that they're not losing money compared to what they forecast. So currency fluctuation has a big impact on the prices of watches. But and the other reason they can't bring them down, of course, is because luxury is all about brand equity, and if you start to reduce your brand equity by saying, hey, this year our product's going to be 25% cheaper, then you significantly reduce the perception of your brand in the eyes of your consumer, and that's luxury 101. You don't want to do that. So no, we won't see prices coming down. The challenge becomes, can you produce products that are new, have a new story to tell, which might mean they've got new materials or different movements. I mean, quartz is beginning to play a part in the industry again, which I think is perversely is quite exciting actually, because quartz, of course, is often blamed for some of the ills of the industry in the 70s and the 80s, but it could yet prove to be the industry's saviour is far too big a word, isn't it? But you know what I mean. It could yet play a really significant role for some of those brands that have high volumes, that have high levels of awareness, and could yet produce new products which draw in a new audience by positioning them more cheaply. Wrong word to use in luxury, but you know what I mean, at a lower price point. So, let's take Tag Heuer in its Formula One, which was reintroduced this year at a very with a limited edition, and obviously in collaboration with Kith at this point. But I think what we're hoping is that, and I don't know this yet incidentally, but we're hoping next year when Tag Heuer gets involved in Formula One again, maybe it'll launch a whole new range of product at a much lower price point that draws in all these Drive to Survive fans around the world who are tuning into Formula One again, and will be tuning into Tag Heuer as well. So it becomes, this is what I mean about the challenge for these brands, trying to stimulate the market and to draw in this next generation of customer. How they're going to do it. Some brands don't care, and some brands won't even try. But I think it becomes incumbent upon those sort of, relatively speaking, mass market luxury brands to stir it all up, to build some excitement. And actually, I've used Tag Heuer as the example. I'm quite excited for Tag Heuer over the next. Well, they've got a 10-year partnership with Formula One.
Absolutely.
That could be transformational for that brand and possibly for the industry as well. We've seen it time and again where actually one brand's success has a very big impact on the industry at large. Patek Philippe for 30 years has been talking about never actually owning one of its watches, and maybe we'll come to that again in a minute. But that strap line, pretty much. I mean, it's amazing the number of people in my real life who can have a stab at that strap line without having the first idea what a Patek Philippe is, or how much it costs, or why you would ever think about buying one. And so that strap line has kind of given the industry a raison d'etre for nearly 30 years. Rolex, of course, is another animal altogether, and its multitude of successes and its huge partnerships and collaborations do wonders for the watch industry at large. So I think Tag Heuer is going to be a big part of the story over the next 5 to 10 years.
That's interesting. And I mean, I'm certainly a big Tag Heuer fan. I love the history that they've got. I think the partnership with Formula One is just is almost written for them, isn't it? Because of their sort of motorsport credentials. So that's quite exciting to see. I'm also a big fan of quartz as a technology, actually. Look, you mentioned Patek. Recent events with Patek definitely seem to capture a sense of complacency in the industry that I think certain brands have exhibited over the years. I mean, Thierry Stern's comments recently about the Cubitus, for one. Do you think, is that his Gerald Ratner moment? Should probably explain who Gerald Ratner is, actually, for people who are watching, and you might be the better person to explain that.
No, go for it. Although, make sure your description of it isn't crap.
Well, yeah, no, true. Well, Ratner's as a brand, as a retail chain of stores here in the UK I just about remember Ratner's being on the high street. They weren't around for that much longer than I can remember, because he famously stood up at an AGM or a company conference and basically picked up the jewellery and sort of said, look, the stuff that we're making is crap, but it sells.
People say to me, how can you sell this for such a low price? I say, because it's total crap. We even sell a pair of earrings for under £1, gold earrings as well. And some people say, well, that's cheaper than a prawn sandwich from Marks and Spencer's. But I have to say, the sandwich will probably last longer than the earrings, but anyway.
Yeah, it makes you wonder whether Stern's comments recently are almost a similar kind of hand grenade. What do you make of that?
It's an interesting comparison. The Gerald Ratner example is often held up as an illustration of how you can never ever take your customer for granted. That's the great lesson of that example. 30 years on, nobody's heard of Ratner's. It doesn't exist anymore. It was bought out and has long since become something else. Patek is not in that position at the moment. Nobody's suggesting that they are. It's still an enormously powerful brand. The collectability of the average Patek, if we can even call it that, remains incredibly high. Demand for the product remains in excess of what the brand is currently, I was going to say able to supply, but let's say that it is supplying. But I think Thierry Stern needs to be careful, if I'm perfectly honest, because we've already touched on Gen Z in the course of this conversation, and Gen Z are getting older and wealthier. They are extremely knowledgeable. They have all the tools at their fingertips to find out anything they want to know about anything they might consider buying. And those comments that he made, they weren't simply in the Financial Times, and then sort of tomorrow's chip paper kind of thing. They will live on forever, as indeed will many of the comments and the responses that they got. And so, the bad publicity that Patek had as a consequence, first of the launch and then secondly as a consequence of that interview, they'll never go away. And so, if you're a Gen Zer, and in 10 years' time you've made enough money to consider spending the equivalent today of 25 to 50 grand on a watch, and you're thinking, what shall I buy? Start doing your research, and the algorithms are going to throw those comments up that Thierry Stern made for a long, long time to come. I did a story in the Financial Times about Gen Z, came out last week, and in it I interviewed the wonderful Scarlett Baker, who's a colleague of mine. She works for GQ and Man About Town and various others, and she's currently, I think she's about 27, so she's sort of right at the top end of Gen Z. She's very much that sort of transitional generation, but she said, we are the ultimate arbiters of bullshit. We see through it straight away because we have the tools to be able to see through it. And you try and dupe us or try and kid us. You can't gaslight Generation Z. Yeah. And so long term, they are the customers of tomorrow. That's the palpable thing to say. But what that means for the long term future of some of the brands who, as you say, are perhaps a little bit complacent about how they treat their customers. They just assume they're always going to be able to sell watches to people. Well, we'll see, won't we? If I were predicting, which is not something I try and do too often, but I would say that will have an impact. And that if we're sitting down having this conversation when we're very grey old men as opposed to just grey middle-aged men, we might be having a very different conversation about who is the most desirable watch brand on the planet today. Well, we'll see.
I recently turned 50. As I've got older, my health has become a bigger priority. I want to be here to see my kids grow up. I want to see them get married and have kids of their own. As someone who loves traditional watches, fitness bands and smartwatches just go against the grain. I want to wear the amazing watches in my collection, and I don't want to have to wear a watch on one wrist and a fitness band or a smartwatch on the other. And I just can't wear watches in bed. Then I found the Ultrahuman Ring Air, and this tiny ring has been a game changer. It's discreet and yet incredibly powerful. Combined with the incredible Ultrahuman app, it tells me what's going on inside my body, whether I'm meeting my fitness goals or if I'm getting the right kind of sleep. It also monitors my heart rate and HRV, heart rate variability, which is a measure of stress. But of course, it also tracks my activity and so much more. The Ultrahuman app also gives you nutrition advice, as well as free access to a whole library of health-related videos and podcasts. And unlike other similar products, it's subscription-free. It's easy to see why the Ultrahuman Ring Air is used by the world's #1 cycling team, as well as other elite athletes. I'll leave a link in the description to the Ultrahuman website, as well as a special discount code for Escapement24 subscribers. So where do you think the industry goes from here?
I think if it wants to remain relevant, and it does, I mean, there's no question of that, relevance will come at the point at which the industry, I think, focuses on, if we're going to boil it down to sort of 3 areas. I think it needs to think very hard about brand and about storytelling. I think it needs to focus very hard on design. We're clearly moving into an age, if ever the age began or ended, I mean, I think it's fairly perpetual, this personally, but I think the age of design being extraordinarily important to consumers is really with us. And we've seen the example of Cartier, for example, over the last, 2016 was the year when they sort of shifted back to focusing very heavily on its classic designs. The success of Cartier over the last 8 years has proved beyond all doubt that actually, if you want to grow your business, if you want to reach new customers, if you want to keep people coming back to your brand and buying again and again and again, Focus on design, focus on iconic design, which is relevant and zeitgeisty and beautiful, and which people look at and say, that's cool. That's a very easy thing to say. It's an incredibly difficult thing to deliver. We certainly shouldn't belittle what Cartier has achieved. I mean, it's quite remarkable, and it's been very skillful and very smart. And then the third, I think, would be, as we've discussed at some length really, is to think about the price to value ratio, because at the moment the price to value ratio in the industry is wrong. That's quite a strong word, but I think if you look at the figures over the last 10 years, there are just fewer people buying the product. There are no two ways of looking at it. I mean, there are fewer watches coming out of Switzerland, fewer people buying new watches. Secondary is another matter, but you see the reason that the secondary market is growing is because the price to value ratio is much better. The promise is you get a watch which is essentially new because it's been, assuming you're buying it from an authorized dealer, you're buying it from somebody who has refurbished it to a point where it is basically brand new, putting a 2-year warranty on it. There's an awful lot of assurance behind a pre-owned watch now, which is tremendous. But if you're looking to sell a new watch, then suddenly you're competing with all of that, and your product looks a little bit expensive. And this is not simply a watch industry problem. It is a luxury industry problem. We should say that as well. This is not a finger being wagged purely at the watch industry. It is a question that the entire luxury industry needs to answer: is how do we make our products attractive to our consumers? Which is a question they always ask, but one of the problems they have at the moment is price.
And going back to your point about design, so we've seen this real move towards embracing vintage. Could you see that continuing? Do you think that we are going to start moving towards maybe seeing? Somebody said to me just a couple of weeks ago, actually, that whilst we've seen a lot of designs from the 50s and 60s and 70s with the likes of the Tissot PRX coming back, that actually the next move might be to look at designs from the 80s and 90s.
I think the two have to exist in parallel. Vintage watch design has been a facet of the watch industry and of watch design for the entirety of the time I've been anywhere near the industry. Shortly before I got into the industry, the Tag Heuer Carrera and Tag Heuer Monaco were reintroduced in the late 1990s, and suddenly, my generation were very excited by these watches, but they were already vintage designs. So this sort of vintage-inspired trend, we talk about it coming and going. We talk about neo-vintage. None of it's new, I'm afraid. There's nothing new under the sun. We might go back to that refrain at this point. But and I think that's a healthy thing on the one hand, because there is an enormous amount of assurance in vintage design. If something looked cool 75 years ago, the chances are it may well still look cool in 75 years' time. That's a very basic way of looking at it, but that there's assurance for buyers in design that lasts. There's also nostalgia in it, and nostalgia is a very important emotional response to a product, because we fundamentally, as human beings, like to look back through rose-tinted glasses and believe that the past was somehow better than the present. And so if watches by design can tap into that will be effective. However, I think if we remain exclusively on that path and have no design innovation whatsoever, the whole thing is always at risk of becoming very stale, very stagnant. Particularly, again, when we're thinking about new generations of consumers who want their own designs. They want their own. Of course they do. People want ownership over their whole lives, but over what they purchase as well. And I'm quite excited to see that we are seeing quite a lot of design innovation coming into the space now. A lot of it through micro brands, as you've already alluded to. But even this year with the introduction of brands like Alto or Toledano and Chan, brands like this who are sort of throwing in these really quite idiosyncratic designs. They're not producing huge volumes of watches, and that's not the point here at this point. I think the point is to say that there is room for creative experimentation, and there's always going to be a customer for it, and that brings energy and it brings excitement and it brings intrigue. So you sort of need those two things running side by side. You need nostalgia. You need the reassurance of a Daytona, which has been available for 60 plus years now. But at the same time, you need somebody to say, yes, but let's take this form and be expressive with it. Let's stretch it. Let's create new forms. Let's try stuff. If it works, great. If it doesn't, well, then we'll try something else.
And which brands do you think? Which of the brands do you think really are in the best position to do that? And who do you think might stand the best chance of getting that right?
That's a good question. That's a difficult question to answer because, I mean, typically the bigger players play it very, very safe. Okay, and of course when they don't play it safe, and we're going to use Patek as the example again here, or we could use Audemars Piguet from 5 years ago or 6 years ago now with the code 1159. The industry, the commentariat, let's be grand about it and call those people out there who are shouting into a microphone, the commentariat, but they're going to be critical of it. They're going to find fault with it. If there's fault, they'll find it, and brands have got to be very conscious of that, which is partly why the more expressive designs are coming from the new guys. You know, they're trying stuff out. They can do it. They have no heritage, no legacy to damage. And so they can afford to be much more adventurous and much more maverick in their designs. But I think, this year, I think Piaget's had a terrific year, for example. And I mean, in the last couple of weeks, we've seen it's the reintroduction. It's a nostalgic, vintage-inspired piece. They're calling it the Andy Warhol Clou de Paris now. You know, back in the 1970s when it was introduced, it didn't have a name. These things weren't quite so necessary back then. But that is a really odd-looking watch. It's big, and it's really quite a big. I tried it on last week. It's a fantastic-looking thing, but it's a curio, but it's making a lot of noise, and a lot of people are interested in it, and it helps build the core temperature of this industry. So it's an illustration of how form and shape and design and massing and all these things that designers think about are really important because they get people excited. They make people interested. So all power to their elbow, really. We've seen it with Audemars Piguet and the remaster stuff that they do, particularly with this year's. How do you describe that shape? I mean, it's angular, it's muscular, it's weird, it's asymmetric, brilliant. Fantastic. Very low volume again, but and it's the design stories which are pricking people's ears up. We've seen so much innovation over the past 15 years really now in movement design and movement technology, so that now if you're buying a new watch that has less than a 5-year warranty on it, you could ask, well, what are you doing? Why are you buying a watch that only has a 2-year warranty on it these days? Which is a bit harsh because, of course, some of the kind of entry-level brands, they need to be at that point in order to be able to offer the watches at the prices they're offering them at. But the movement story for me, the mechanization story for me, it's not done, but it's largely done. All the advances that have been made in anti-magnetism, for example, the watches that we buy these days are much more practical than they used to be. They work, they're much more reliable, they're much more accurate, they're much more precise. A lot of that's been done now to the point where I think that marketing and industry around it it's just less relevant than it used to be. And I think you might be throwing good money after bad if you're talking about heritage and movement design and accuracy and so on, chronometry. These are words that they've gathered dust, and I think the industry needs to be much more explosive in the way that it describes itself, which is about design, and potentially it's about price as well. Hey, look at what you can get for your money, and there are very few brands who are saying that at the moment, and that's not strictly a luxury principle, of course, but I think that people need to feel like they're getting value, and all these mores are somehow tied up together, and the brands that succeed over the next 5 or 10 years will be the ones that sort of pull in all these different influences and recognize these different traits in the consumer base, and deliver products that, I say, tick those boxes. What a horrible cliche.
Yeah, but I completely understand what you're saying, and I think it's interesting when you look at a brand like Tudor. So of course they've introduced META certification. It appears to be the thing that they're going to bring in now across the entire model range. I mean, if you look at recent examples and see that as a trend, but then I guess they may well get to a point that once METAS is evident across all of their models, and where do they go from there? Whether maybe they create a new standard, who knows? Yeah,
I think that serves us the point really neatly, actually, that once META certification has been rolled out across Tudor's collection, I don't think they necessarily do need a new standard. I mean, maybe they do, but I think what they need is stories around design, around collaboration. We haven't really touched on collaboration, but that's another very significant facet of what's making brands successful at the moment. So how much does the average Tudor buyer care about the fact that his watch is resistant to 15,000 Gauss, or that it's accurate to within a certain number of seconds a day? Probably not very much. Much less than they care about the fact that it looks amazing on their wrist and that it makes them feel more confident, and that perhaps that David Beckham wears it. That might be important to some customers. It's not important to me per se, but it's that's where the value is added more these days. Is in design, is in association, and fundamentally on how hard it hits your pocket. So that serves the point very well for me.
Well, you've led us on nicely. You've used the C word, collaboration. We've had so much of it. Do you think we've hit peak collaboration yet, or do you think there's a lot more to come?
No, nowhere near. Nowhere near. I mean, it's very difficult to find powerful collaborations that genuinely amplify your brand. But no, I think it's absolutely critical. I think that brands need to do it to prove that they are, I keep coming back to this term there, to prove that they're relevant. Audemars Piguet's success over the last 20 years is not down to the fact that they produce new movements. It's not down to the fact that they are even capable of producing some of the most spectacular movements on the planet. It's down to the fact that they've positioned themselves as one of the coolest brands on the planet. The partnership with Jay-Z in 2005, I think it was, sort of kick-started a season of collaboration, which has made them, top 5. What are they? Top 3 or 4 now, and they've leapfrogged Patek in terms of annual revenues, when 10 years ago they were a long way behind. So, and most of that is about branding. It's about collaboration. It's about aligning your products with the people everyone's talking about, which is quite a crude way of looking at it, perhaps, but that's the market that we're in at the moment. And so I think that, if you're a brand wondering which step to take next, looking at who can help you power up and amplify your brand is one of the first things that you need to be doing. There are plenty of brands out there who don't do it, of course, and Patek is the number one example there. They don't have ambassadors, they don't have arch collaborators, but I don't think it would hurt them if they were to venture into that space. And it's all about finding the right partner, the right collaborator. So, I'm not for a minute suggesting that Patek needs to go and slap at their watch on a Premier League footballer or something like that. Not at all. But can they find a partner in the world of design, for example, who might actually design them a watch that people like? Maybe that's the route that they should be.
Well, yeah, but I think Thierry Stern has declared himself as being the best designer in the company already. So they might.
There are plenty out there who might refute that. I would encourage him to broaden his scope.
Robin, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you today. Your insights are just incredible, and I think it would be fantastic to do this again in 12 months' time and see where the industry is in the future.
Check back in, see where we are.
Absolutely, yeah. But no, thank you so much for inviting me down here. And
thanks for coming.
It's been a fantastic discussion.
Nice to see you. Let's do it again.